My name is Abbas Milani. Before I say a couple of words about our speaker tonight, I want to announce at least one of our upcoming events. The next week, April 28th, we're going to have Professor Jenkins talk about Nazi Germany and Reza Shah. She has done some remarkable work, archival work, on the relationship between Nazi Germany and the Iranian government under Reza Shah. And as you know, this is the subject of a great deal of hearsay and a great deal of gossip and innuendo. She has actually gone down on some really interesting archival research. Shah, about whom she will be talking, is essentially one of the masterminds of financial restructuring during the Reza Shah period. There is also a personal connection. Shah was the person with whom my uncle worked in the when he was working for Reza Shah, Shadman, and his entry into politics was as sort of a mentee of Shah. So it's very interesting to see what kind of a character and what kind of influence he had. I think you all have these events, our upcoming events. We have Sons of Spies, Chefs, and we have Mr. Behnoud coming in the next few weeks. And about tonight, as some of you know, a few months ago we brought Houshang Golshiri's archives, personal papers, to Stanford. In the conference we had, I said that I think this might be the single biggest collection of papers at any university. And just this morning, by coincidence, someone wrote to me and said, I've come to Iran. At Tehran University, they have a Jamalzadeh collection of papers. I think that might be bigger than Golshiri. I said, well, I stand corrected. The second biggest collection. And the Golshiri Foundation and the Golshiri family was very helpful and graceful in bringing us all of this. And we are about to begin the process of digitalizing these. So I think before the year is out, all of these papers will be available online for anyone who wants to look at them. And one of the things we decided when we launched the program, when we launched we announced the arrival of the paper, was that each year we're going to try, in consultation with the Golshiri Foundation in Iran, try to find and identify someone who's doing really interesting, unusual work on Golshiri and bring them to Stanford for a talk. So in a sense, this is the first talk in what I hope will be an annual event of someone who is doing some very interesting, unusual work on Golshiri to come to Stanford and possibly stay a couple of days, few days, to work with the papers and then deliver a paper here. And when I talked with Farzaneh Taheri and Barbad Golshiri to introduce someone to us to bring as the first of this series, what I hope will be lecture series on Golshiri, they both told me, in Iran there's no one who's doing better work on Golshiri than our speaker tonight, Amir Arian. And I have to say that having begun to read some of his work, he's really a remarkable young man from a new generation of Iranian critics, scholars, and in his case, writer himself, a very successful writer, who are beginning to look at Iranian literature in a very different way than the past generation did. They bring to it a sense of theoretical sophistication that is rather unique, and they bring with it a sense of immersing themselves in the literature of Iran. They are as willing to criticize the giants of Iranian literature as they are willing to criticize Western theories about Iran. I just began reading, he's kindly sent it to me, I just began reading his PhD dissertation. It's really a remarkably fascinating look at 4 texts I don't think anyone has ever put together in a kind of a comparative study. He's comparing 2 classical texts, Hajj Baba and the Persian letters of Montesquieu, with 2 of the best-selling books about Iran in the last 10 years. Azar Nafisi's Reading Lolita in Tehran and Satrapi's Persepolis. I haven't finished reading it. I just began reading it this morning. I read 1 chapter to be exact. And it's really a fascinating, remarkable work. And he's also a very successful writer, as I said. He has his PhD from Australia. That's the dissertation that I was reading. But he's going back to school as a MFA student at NYU, where he has been accepted into the creative writing program. He has translated some really remarkably well chosen works of literature. He has translated some of my favorite novels. Paul Auster, for example, is translated, and some of Doctorow and P.D. James. I don't know which one of P.D. James he has translated, but I'm sure some of you have seen P.D. James's novels turned into great films. And for an Iranian critic, an Iranian serious critic, an Iranian serious writer, to know that P.D. James is a great writer takes a great taste, because the generation past looked down at mysteries and these kinds of stories as cheap police mystery novels, bulk books. But P.D. James is a great writer, and it takes a great writer to know a great writer. So I'm very grateful that Mr. Arian accepted our invitation, traveled from Iran to here, then from here to NYU, and an MFA in creative writing. He's, as I said, written a novel that I haven't had the good fortune to read, but I will. And he's going to talk about Houshang Golshiri and his prose. So please welcome Mr. Arian.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. And thank you, Dr. Milani, for very generous remarks. I'm incredibly flattered now. I don't know how to begin this. And my special thanks to Dr. Milani and his colleagues at Stanford and Golshiri family for inviting me and setting me up for this event. I'm very privileged to be standing here this evening. In the introduction to his collected short stories, Dark Side of the Moon, Houshang Golshiri refers to his 2 major preoccupations with respect to his prose. First, the music. He points out that he was pursuing a sort of writing that lingers between poetry and prose, a writing that holds a musical quality. In order to pull this off, Golshiri taps into the treasure trove of classical Persian poetry. Having started off as a poet, Golshiri had an experienced ear for the musical nuances of Persian language. He succeeded in composing a sort of prosaic music that over time became the distinguishing characteristic of his work and remains unique to this day. In that sense, one could compare Golshiri to Ahmad Shamlou. Shamlou composed a unique poetical music by looking into the masterpieces of Persian prose, Tarikh Bayhaqi in particular. Golshiri took the opposite direction. Shamlou explored classical prose to create a new music for poetry. Golshiri, on the other hand, explored classical poetry in order to create a new music for prose. Golshiri's second preoccupation, pointed out in that introduction, has also to do with classical Persian literature. Golshiri firmly believed that Persian language has an enormous amount of unrealized potential. He argued that the current impoverishment of Persian prose is caused by the sheer lack of awareness of the classical prose. too many authors treated the language as though it had no past. And Iranian contemporary literature, in his view, had rendered numerous structures, sentence structures and even passage structures in larger scales, and writing strategies obsolete, and rarely actualized the possibilities that could be traced and found in Persian classics. Those aspects of Golshiri's prose are well known and have been discussed fairly extensively, both by himself, who was very conscious of his development as a writer, and the critics who have been scrutinizing his writing for more than half a century. Here I would like to discuss a third preoccupation, which doesn't come up in his writing, in his essays on his fiction, and in that introduction to that collection of stories. And to the best of my knowledge, neither himself nor others have explored to any meaningful extent. This is perhaps because this aspect does not emerge in Golshiri's writing as a quality or a characteristic of his prose. It is not a merely literary quality. Rather, it is a historical, somewhat political one, and figures only when one puts his writing in the context of the history of modern Persian prose. So here I'm trying to show that Golshiri's prose, historically speaking, is a major turning point in the modernization of Iranian literature. By modernization of Iranian literature, I'm referring to the process that was started by Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh around the time of the Constitutional Revolution. So before getting to what Golshiri did, let me step back and spend a few minutes on Jamalzadeh's project, which will tie to the competition over the size of archives Mr. Milan talked about. So it is a commonplace to regard Jamalzadeh as the founding father of modern Iranian literature. But what he actually did for laying that foundation is still under discussed. Like other literary projects of the turn of the 20th century in Iran, Jamalzadeh's project was as political as it was literary. Here, during this talk, I will talk about politics, or will use this term or adjectives like political, but by political I mean it in a kind of very broad, loose sense of the term. It's more of like a philosophical, political concept. It's about a reflection on one's place with regard to the state, or one's place with regard to other people or other countries, and beyond that. So it's more like a geopolitical, philosophical concept than a purely political one. So Jamalzadeh's project had a lot to do with the cultural politics of Iran at the dawn of the Constitutional Revolution, as well as the politics of Persian language. My argument is that Golshiri's project also pursues similar goals, although he never articulates them in those terms and approaches them from a very different point of view under different historical circumstances. We'll get to that in a minute after this Jamalzadeh section. Jamalzadeh began his career when Persian language was in a rather bleak place. Decades of disastrous Qajar rule had severely damaged the country economically and politically. The consequences were felt in culture too, and the impoverishment of the language was a blatant manifestation of it. There are staggering figures about the widespread poverty and the political bankruptcy under the Qajars. Lesser known figures of this calamity reveal what happened to the language at the time, or the politics of the language, I mean. According to Erwan Abrahamian, so I don't know how it goes to the next page. Oh yeah, it's okay.
Why is it
okay?
right?
Yeah, it's working. Okay. So according to Abrahamian, as you see, we are talking about the turn of the 20th century now. The literacy rate was 5%, right? And we're talking about a population of about 12 million. 5% of Iranian people were literate at the time. which is not surprising. And that kind of literacy was limited to Quranic schools, and it was a very narrow kind of knowledge, which is not surprising. What is really surprising, at least to me, is that less than 50% of the population could understand the language of the land, right? Less than 50% could communicate in Persian or could understand Persian. So when you actually, imagine that situation, right? You have a country in which more than half of the population doesn't understand the official language of the land, you can surmise what's going on between the state and the people. So Iran was not only a political and economic disaster, it also was a linguistic failure, a patchwork where different parts could not even communicate with each other. It obviously increases the risk of disintegration and mayhem, because when communication channels are blocked, no central government can maintain the unity necessary for the survival of the nation. In the light of these figures, we can understand better what drove Jamalzadeh to develop his particular style, also the political meaning of his project. Jamalzadeh was the son of a renowned orator, Jamaluddin Baiz Isfahani, and perhaps his main takeaway from listening to his father's speeches was a deep awareness of the incredible power of words for reaching out to ordinary people, so-called. That must have triggered the idea of literary democracy, the famous concept that he coined around the same time, at the beginning of the 20th century. That must have triggered this concept in his mind. Jamalzadeh was dismayed by his colleagues because he believed they didn't appreciate the power of words for affecting reality. His anger manifests itself in his important introduction to his collection of stories, Once Upon a Time. In this seminal text, Jamalzadeh attacks literary intellectuals for regarding the ordinary people below human, awam kal-an'am, as he put it, and thereby falling short of fulfilling their tasks. The result, he argued, was the abundance of unreadable texts that serve as a jargon available only to specific cliques. Jamalzadeh, in contrast, pursues a middle language, a bridge across the chasm between the language of the elite and the language of the people. And I'm quoting him here. In our country, authors usually neglect the ordinary people and produce unreadable purple writing. In the civilized world, however, the cultures that pioneer progress steer towards concise, comprehensible writing. Men of letters there attempt to dress up complex concepts in terms understandable to everyday folks and articulate their thoughts into narrative to make them more accessible. If Jamalzadeh's introduction to Once Upon a Time is his theoretical manifesto, his best-known short story, Farsi is Sweet, is his fictional one. In this short story, 4 people happen to spend a night together in a prison cell. And the characters are Ramazan, an illiterate man who speaks the language of street, Sheikh, who is a typical Qajar cleric bent on convoluted combinations of Arabic and Farsi that barely make sense, and Monsieur, a westernized flamboyant man whose speech is interspersed with unnecessary French words, and also, of course, the narrator, who represents Jamalzadeh. It's kind of obvious. As the inmates speak, the narrator sits aside and watches this linguistic circus. He raises an issue that was on Jamalzadeh's mind at the time. Why these 4 people who are supposed to have the same mother tongue fail to understand each other, because there is no communication whatsoever between them. Such a situation, in Jamalzadeh's view, was a recipe for a cultural collapse, and Jamalzadeh was determined to address it in his writing. That's what his famous literary democracy is about, creating a literary space open to all forms of linguistic performances, a space where various forms of language meet and interact, a middle ground that could be shared by all Iranians. So his literary project was, at least in his mind, a unifying project a part of the constitution of a nation state. This trend continued more or less for another half century. Writers like Sadiq Hidayat and Sadiq Chubak came up with proses and styles that bridged the gap, or at least tried to bridge the gap, between the language of the elite and the language of the people. Until the 1960s and the 1970s, which is the time Golshiri appears. So my description of Jamalzade's project is pretty ambiguous and is not that good, because he's not the main concern of this paper, but I'm happy to discuss it after the talk in Q&A. So as Golshiri comes on the stage, Iran is a very different place compared to Jamalzade's time. Consequently, the politics of Persian language is also very different. So in the same book, this is, by the way, Ervan Abrahamian's A History of Modern Iran. So in the same book, on the same page, I guess, I believe, yeah. So Abrahamian, makes this comparison. As you see, by the end of the century, by the end of the 20th century, so even less than that, these figures belong to, the 1980s and the 1990s, but we're discussing 1960s and the 70s, but you can get the idea of the progress, or the rate of the progress. I'm sorry. So, as you see, by the end of the century, literacy rate has shot up to almost 90%, it's above 80%, and 1.6 million people are enrolled in colleges and universities, and more importantly, more than 85%, right, about 90% of the population could now communicate in Persian. So that kind of concern, that kind of chaos that Jamalzadeh experienced at the beginning of the century did not apply to Golshiri's time. It was not a preoccupation for him. So we are talking about a very different Iran, especially in terms of the politics of Persian language. The literacy rate, as you see, has gone up dramatically, and Jamalzadeh's unifying literary project, is no longer necessary or meaningful. So it seems to me that in Golshiri's writing, from the outset, a sense of anxiety about the whole idea of literary democracy comes through. The opening up to the language of the ordinary people, which was highly fashionable when he started off as a writer, is absent from his work. In fact, not only does he refuse to go along with the idea of literary democracy, but he takes the opposite direction. Golshiri aspires to a sort of linguistic concision and complexity, and tries to revive a notion that was out of vogue for a long time: eloquence. I've got too many things around me. Eloquence in that sense differs markedly from what the Qajars had in mind. Jamalzadeh was rightly worried that the Qajar eloquence had turned into a jargon, a language stifled by its dead elitism and inaccessibility. Although Golshiri never specifically mentions that, from his writing one can deduce that he believes in the exhaustion of the idea of literary democracy, and works towards a more precise, calculated, concise, and eloquent prose. His version of eloquence, however, moves away from elitism. It is, in fact, the completion of the idea of literary democracy. Golshiri's prose is the point where the fragmentary nature of Jamalzadeh and Chubak's prose comes to resolution. Golshiri takes this step by creating a very strong voice in every story, a voice so compelling that can dominate the story and go on without sounding limited or compromising. I believe that the first moment Golshiri achieved this voice comes about in 1960 in a short story titled A Man with a Red Tie. So this short story takes the form of a report written by a Savak agent assigned to follow a literary intellectual. The story is narrated by the voice of an out-and-out bureaucrat. His voice dominates the whole narrative and occupies every corner of the story. Even the voice of the people who are not supposed to talk like him echo his voice. Because of its gravity, the voice of the bureaucrat exerts a strong pull on other voices and keeps them in its orbit. As a result, rather than the multivocal, democratic style of Jamalzadeh and Chubak, which scatters various linguistic forms and voices across the text, here Golshiri creates a linguistic constellation with the strong voice of the narrator as its sun and other voices as planets that revolve around it within a certain order. Golshiri perfects this style in a collection of stories called My Little Prayer Room, published in 1975. The same vocal strategy applies to the stories of this book. A powerful voice starts the story and keeps all other voices under its sway to the very end. This literary device has inevitable consequences, and some of them go beyond the will of the writer. For instance, all the narrators of those stories experience a profound solitude, caused usually by secret. In My Little Prayer Room, the title story of the book, the protagonist's sixth toe is his secret. In both sides of the coin, the role of the narrator is in an old man's suicide in prison drives the story. That's his secret. The confessors in Innocent 1 and Innocent 2 carry a secret they cannot share with other members of the community. The strange, sometimes scary protagonists of those stories often deal with unresolved mysteries in solitude. This confined range of moods and characters is the price Golshiri pays for focusing on the voice, on the construction of an eloquent prose, or as I call it here, on constituting new eloquence for Persian prose. In order for the eloquent voice of the narrator to take hold, the voice of the other is either locked out or subsumed under the voice of the narrator. As Golshiri moved forward and his preoccupations expanded, addressing more complex issues, especially ones that include the collective, became increasingly important. Around the time of the revolution in 1979, Golshiri had already reached a fork. He had to either stick to his fairly confined settings and characters and maintain his prosaic achievements, or compromise on his prose and widen the net of his fiction to a considerable extent. The revolution itself, which was an incredible spectacle of collective activity, made it even more urgent to make that decision. But it didn't take long for him to come up with a solution, and it was a rather brilliant solution, so I try to explore it a little bit here. Golshiri's response to this dilemma was the deployment of a narrator that has always resided in the margin of storytelling techniques, the pronoun we. In Golshiri's work, this narrator, by which I mean, you have a narrator that functions as a we. We went there, we tried this, we did that, we slept, we woke up, and so on. Right? So in Golshiri's work, this narrator appeared full-blown in 1980 in the story, The Victory Chronicle of the Magi. The story is a powerful, succinct report on hopes and disappointments of the revolution centered around the prohibition of alcohol. Here, Golshiri's prose demonstrates the same level of eloquence and surgical precision. However, rather than those insulated, weird characters in their isolated rooms, as we saw in previous stories, here a collective subject breaks out into the open. The narrator, we, goes through the revolution as one mind, as witnesses, and reports as one voice, right? So you have a collective narrator that functions as one voice. To give us a touchstone, Golshiri pits the experience of this we against one character, namely Barat. So Yeah, this is a passage chosen from the first pages of the story, the Victory Chronicle of the Magi. This is the moment that Bharat, goes to the statue, that famous statue of Shah on a horse, and which was taken down through the revolution, and tries to take it down. So as Bharat jumped off the truck, we made way for him, held his legs, and helped him up to the statue. Then he crept up the leg of the horse, grabbed its tail, and turned over to the top. He crawled forward and settled on the crest. We, the people standing as far as you could see, watched him. From the other side of the square, military trucks discoursed soldiers. We passed the news on to Bharat, but he kept hammering at the horse. Right? So, as you see, the narrative kind of goes back and forth between Bharat and the we, right? And this structure goes on throughout the story to the end. So Bharat, who used to run a bar, is a passionate revolutionary, but as things turn out badly, he grows disillusioned and gives up his zeal. The story then comes down to the conflict between the we, who stubbornly sticks to its revolutionary ideals and denies the facts on the ground, and the defiant Bharat. Golshiri manages to maintain his masterful, eloquent, uncompromising prose, yet he overcomes the shortcomings of that prose in addressing grand events and collective experiences by employing this technique. Among Golshiri's stories in the 80s, which is perhaps the most fertile period in his career, 4 long stories are written with we as narrator. The last one is a unique experiment in storytelling. The story is titled Khane Roshanan, and it's a little tricky to translate it because it has several connotations. Has it been translated? Yeah. What is the title?
I don't remember. I translated it.
Oh, did you? Okay. And you don't
remember the title?
Right. So I translated it as House Illuminators, which is not good, but just as a tentative title, accepted. Okay, so in House Illuminators, the we consists of objects, the furniture of a house, right, which together report on the behavior of the owner of the house. Through their report, we get to know the man who is a writer, his relationship with his wife and daughter, his time in exile, and so on. We get a lot of information about his life. The dynamic for giving traction to the voice of the narrator and making it compelling is similar to the Victory Chronicle. Just as we oscillated between Bharat and others in that story, here we travel back and forth between the abstract general we, which is the combination of all the furniture, and the individual articles in the house, whose voices concretize and put flesh on the narrator. So, okay, I didn't know you translated it. I hope it's not that disappointing. So it is also selected from the first page of that story. It's a very difficult text to translate, by the way, because it's closer to poetry than prose, and there's a lot of unusual stuff going on in that text. So it must have been dark as us, sitting quiet in our places, no whisper. When it's dark, we don't talk to each other. The mirror saw him first. He was dark, standing on the threshold, holding a bag in one hand and the dark silhouette of something in another hand. The mirror, illuminated by the lamps in the corridor, watched him and waited for him to switch on the light and start his quiet yet constant conversation with the whiteness of the wall before him. Here we see a seamless transition from the voice of the we to the report of the mirror, which is one of its components, the components of the we. Mirror reports back to we the very moment it witnesses the man entering the room. Then the we comes back with a set of abstract reflections, and this is what it does throughout the story. Then another component, be it the sofa the man sits on or the clock the man looks at, reports back to the we. And that's how we get the whole sense of the location, the character, and the narrator all together. Here again, Golshiri finds a way to perform his ability in composing his eloquent prose while telling the story of a collective. One of the continuous notions about Golshiri's writing is that his novels fall behind his short stories. His most acclaimed novel, Prince Ehtajab, is in fact a novella, and so are his other praised longer works such as The King of the Benighted and Christine and Kid. He has written longer books, of course, such as Rai's Last Lamb, Jannameh, Mirrors with Cover Doors, but in those cases the episodic nature of the narrative makes it similar to a collection of long stories meticulously threaded together, rather than a novel in the conventional sense of the word. It seems that Golshiri's choice of prose was the main stumbling block to his becoming a novelist. For a writer like Golshiri, whose primary agenda was the construction of new eloquence for Iranian literature, writing a novel required a great deal of sacrifice and exposure, which would have meant doing away with the prose he had accomplished. Well, not doing away, it's a strong word, but he certainly had to compromise on the prose of his stories. Overall, what Golshiri achieves in his writing, and I'm concluding this talk, is a brilliant prose that introduces to Iranian literature an idea it had abandoned since the constitutional revolution until 1960s and 70s. At the turn of the 20th century, the idea of eloquence, the notion of unified and polished prose, had taken a backseat to Jamalzadeh's literary democracy. The situation sustained for decades until Golshiri broke the mold. He showed how one can compose eloquent, univocal Persian prose without falling into the trap of the convoluted Qajar style. He writes his early stories deploying such prose, and expands the scope of his writing after the revolution by using the pronoun we in several stories in the 80s. However, while this path earned him his place in the pantheon of Iranian short story writers, it somewhat blocked his way to writing quote-unquote great novels. Towards the end of his life, one notices a gradual opening of his prose, a leaning towards a more novelistic discourse manifested in later stories such as Ganjnameh and Zarathustra's Fire. But he didn't get to develop and realize the new potentials of his writing since his life was cut short under the pressure inflicted upon him by mercenaries of the forces who deeply and passionately hate novels. Thank you. Okay, so I think we've got like half an hour for sure.
So why don't I begin to ask a question?
Sure.
In a sense, I disagree with part of your thesis, because I think Golshiri was trying to create a democratic aesthetics, but the kind of aesthetics that he wanted to create was very different than Jamalzadeh.
Yes.
Jamalzadeh still talked to the people.
Right.
Golshiri wanted the people to talk to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
He truly democratized the text by making it incumbent on the reader to be active creator of meaning. He wasn't going to make it easy for you. In one passage he says, I use the Platonic system. I make an illusion, and I know the reader is smart enough to get it.
Yeah.
The bulk of Iranian writers thought of their readers as essentially imbeciles. They needed to chew it out for them. Golshiri, to me, was truly the most democratic aesthetics.
No, I don't disagree with that. The thing is, I use democracy in a kind of a formal sense of the word, in the sense that, and it's very focused on the language. So what I mean by democracy here is that, something like Sang Sabur, right? Sadeh Chubak Sang Sabur. You have a kind of a formal democracy there where you have characters who, the story is kind of compartmentalized between characters, different characters, and each one of them brings his or her own voice into it, right? So you have this kind of plethora of voices that come together to tell a story to us. It is apparently democratic. On the surface, it is democratic because you have this, multivocal structure. And it was very, it was prevalent since Jamalzadeh to Chubak, right? Even Hidayat did it, and many other writers. So Golshiri does away with that, but it doesn't mean that he did away with democracy, with the idea of democracy. He did away with the idea of formal democracy, or democracy in the sense of, having a variety of voices in the text, right? He didn't care about that. So this is what I mean here, right? It's more about having like a variety of voices in the text, which Jamalzadeh considered being democratic, and how Golshiri kind of moves away from that and constitutes his own prose or his own style. So yeah, I can even argue about him being more democratic than them from a different point of view, in the sense that when you have this, in a way that Jacques Rancière talks about Flaubert, right? Because Flaubert was, he absolutely did the same thing with French language, right? He kind of put aside the Balzacian kind of circus of languages, or various voices and narrators, and created a kind of equality across the board for all the voices and all the words, right? So Rancière argues there that if there was, any democracy anywhere, this is to be found in Flaubert's writing, not in Balzac's writing, because this is the, ultimate equality. So this is another point of view to argue for democracy in Golshiri's work. But here I try to put him in the context of the development of Persian prose since the Constitutional Revolution to the Islamic Revolution.
I wonder if you can say a little bit more about this use of we, I, which is very interesting. What he's trying to achieve with it. You can elaborate more. It just reminds me of a recent book, relatively recent book. It's called The Buddha in the Attic by Julie Otasuka. She talks about the experience of Japanese American, Japanese Americans in the early days of past century. So she uses we and I, and she moves from we to I in a very interesting way that creates both collective, but also a singular eyes in it that creates collective. That's kind of interesting move if you can just sort of.
Yeah, that's what I think too. I think it's a very brilliant strategy for writing a story of a revolution, right? Particularly when you have a short story, when you don't have this large room for maneuver, and you've got to cram a lot of things into a fairly limited space. So under such circumstances, what can you do? You even have to bring in a number of characters, which a short story doesn't allow, or you've got to find a very kind of narrow territory to operate on. So what Golshiri does is he finds a strategy to tell us the story of a grand event as a revolution, as the Iranian Revolution, but cover a lot of grounds in the space of a short story. It's also important in another way when you look at it, because the revolution, particularly the Islamic Revolution that we had, was indeed carried out by a we, right? So, and I think all of the revolutions, it happens there too. So you had a large number of people from all walks of life coalescing around just one demand, right? So when you have this situation and you want to cover it in a short story, I think the best way to do it is to narrate the whole thing with a we. In this way, he shows us how the whole kind of process of the revolution gets ossified, and gets solidified in a limited range of ideas and notions and slogans, and how a large number of people kind of stick to it without being able to thinking critically about it, right? And in the other story that I pointed out is, so you have that structure in another story, Sharh Qaside Jamaliye, right? So there is a village, and the people of the village talk as a we to us about a kind of a half crazy man who brings a number of camels into that village. In another case, in House Illuminators, or the original title, whatever it is, in that case you also have a similar situation. You have the furniture of a house which could not have like distinct characters, right? You cannot, separate them and give them. You can do that, but it probably doesn't get off the ground. But when you actually use this we as the representative of the furniture as a whole, and yet you bring in separate articles one by one in interaction with the we, and you make this back and forth, you create a space that. Probably for the first time in Iranian story writing, at least, you have a story in which the still life is speaking to you, and its voice is convincing. Its voice is persuasive, right? So at least in these two instances, given the subject of the story, I think this kind of choice of the narrator is very successful.
Do you see along with other works of Golshiri, or you think it was kind of experiment or kind of new idea?
Yeah, I think the latter. And I think Jannameh. So was it in continuation with other works of Golshiri, or was it like a separate experiment? I think it was it was a try. It was an experiment, and it was like a leap towards writing a grand novel. But frankly, I don't think that Jannameh is a successful book, even though it has very interesting parts and very fascinating chapters, very powerful prose here and there. But as a whole, actually, I consider it an unsuccessful experiment, and it makes sense to me that it was a failure, because that wasn't the territory in which Golshiri succeeded or could succeed, right? That was not his stuff. But that's my opinion. I don't know.
So he's most biographical.
Yes, that's his most biographical as well.
Essentially, the biography of himself and his father. So it is his territory, but it's not his style.
Well, probably because it's so personal and it's so it's so close to himself. You don't see the masterful Golshiri that you see in other stories. You see a writer that is rambling on in many chapters. This is far from him in his other works. He was very actually precise on being brief and concise. So yeah, Jannameh, as you said, is an exceptional work in his oeuvre, and I don't consider it a success.
But you also seem to not think Barre Gomshudeh is successful.
Yeah,
is that?
it is. Well, as I pointed out to this book, I think it is a great book. Well, it's a great collection of novellas, right? Because it has 3 or 4 different stories woven together through some textual techniques and textual kind of tricks, right? So between each 2 novella, you've got like a classical text or this archaic document that connects these books together. So even there, and it's a very kind of common style. Even particularly recently, you see a lot of that stuff in American and European novel. But still, I think it actually is a kind of a testament to what I'm saying here. Golshiri, when he gets to like 90, 100 pages, right? From that point on, he either has to like change the style or move to a different place and employ a different kind of prosaic strategy, or if he goes on like for 200, 300, 500 pages like what he did in ENDOWMENT. And this is the only case that he did so. He barely pulls it off in those very long texts.
Just if you could comment on your own work, that where are you taking this particular line of work? I mean, how do you continue?
Well, actually it arises from a project that I was working on. Well, I stopped, but I was working on last year. So I wanted to write like a history of Persian prose, right, from a modern Persian prose from Jamalzadeh to the moment, to now. And what I found is this interesting oscillation that happens all the time. So you have this kind of opening up to all sorts of languages, which happens with Jamalzadeh and then Hidayat. And then Ibrahim Golestan, actually, he could have been a figure that I could discuss here, but because he kind of takes a very similar approach even before Golshiri. He precedes Golshiri in that regard. Yeah, but the thing with him is that he stopped probably too early but anyway, so this back and forth between this kind of open, embracing style that Jamalzadeh suggests and Hidayat and Chubak pick up, and this narrowing of it and this kind of move towards concision and eloquence that you see in Golshiri and Ibrahim Golestan. Then when we get to the 80s, the 1980s, after the revolution, you have another opening up, right, with Dawlat Abadi, Ahmad Mahmoud, and early novels of Barahani. So they kind of reproduce the idea of Jamalzadeh for the post-Islamic revolution time. They do that, and then after that, kind of acolytes or students of Golshiri, or whatever you call them, they react to that opening up by, again, narrowing down and moving towards eloquence. People like Shahryar Mandanipur, Abu Turab Khosravi, and the rest of them. And in 2000, like over the last 10 or 15 years, you have another, although in a smaller scale, you have another kind of opening up, right, to the language of the middle class, the language of, the youth, the language of, streets of Tehran and things like that, which is not that successful, but it harks back to the idea of literary democracy. So what we have had, this kind of pendulum, this swinging back and forth between kind of two poles. At one pole, you have this precision, this surgical prose, this eloquence, right, which is dominant. And the other end, you have this opening up, this kind of multiplicity of voices, this plethora of characters and narratives. We have been swinging, from this end to the other. But I think one of the things that has damaged, that's been detrimental to Iranian novel, is that we rarely have been able to stop at the middle point, right? We rarely be able to kind of stop the pendulum at a certain point and get to a kind of a combination or a synthesis of these two poles. So this is a part of that project.
Golshiri came to Tehran University, where I used to teach, and he gave a talk about how he wanted to write the greatest novel of 20th century. Not joking, he really believed that he could.
Yeah.
And as we walked out, I was talking to him, I said, don't you think that creating the greatest novel requires a context, requires a middle class, requires a kind of language? He said, no. You can, with perseverance, and with genius, essentially, with the combination of hard work and genius, you can transcend those limits.
Do you agree?
Huh?
Do you agree?
No, clearly not. I don't.
Yeah.
Nothing happens out of nothing.
Right.
There's a logic to history, and but the point that you said that part of his democratization is, if I understood you correctly, and please correct me if I didn't, is that he sort of democratized the language by making it, making all words equal.
Yes, exactly. That's what I mean.
But, you know, part of what makes novels is polyphony. It's this multiplicity of voices. And I think there is multiplicity of voices in Golshiri. I don't think there is an equality of words. I think there is, you know, it's really like a Munabbat Kari, where different things have different weight in them. And he has, I don't know of anyone who has used poetry as effectively as he has in a novella.
Yes.
He has actually, in Shah not just poetic language, he uses poetry
quotations,
into a novel form, which is, I think, remarkable.
Okay, let me say we are talking about now the polyphonic nature of the language in Chubak is different from Golshiri, right? So there you have, in Chubak, you have a variety of tones or moods of speech. In Golshiri, you barely get that, at least in his successful works, in his successful short stories. He's not interested in that, in my opinion, right? To have, I don't know, a goon speaking like a goon, a mullah speaking like a mullah, a prostitute speaking like one, and so on. Golshiri is not interested in that, at least in his successful works, I believe. He pursues polyphony elsewhere, not in the tone, right? That's the whole point of my talk, right? How he moves away from this formal polyphony or formal democracy, which makes an equilibrium between the multiplicity of tones and multiplicity of voices and democracy. How he moves away from that and tries to achieve the same kind of goal or the same kind of ideal through eloquence, right? Through precision, concision, and this, very kind of a meticulous prose, right? This is the question actually here that I'm saying. Well, this is the description of what happens between Jamalzadeh and Golshiri. But what Golshiri does actually to carry that out is, is a subject, is a debate for another day.
I think part of Chubak's polyphony, for example, in Sangi Sabur, is a phony polyphony, in my view. He has seen something in James Joyce and he thinks he has to emulate it. It's an emulated polyphony. Golshiri is a very organic, ingrown, and the source is as much from Quran as it is from Joyce. He takes his clues stylistically from the same tradition that he's trying to bring the poetry, the prose, the Bayhaqi.
Right. Well, no, I probably wouldn't call Chubak's polyphony phony, but
not all of it. In some of them it's brilliant.
Yeah.
But Sangi Sabur, because the quotes you gave, the examples you gave, were actually from Sangi Sabur. I find that very phony. I find that very.
Okay.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all for coming.